Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly Update. I'm Kevin Gostola.
I'm Brian Sonnenstein.
And each week we are running down the latest news in whistleblowing and press freedom. On today's show, we will depart from our normal routine and we're going to focus solely on WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's upcoming extradition hearing, as well as a recent motion to free Chelsea Manning filed by her legal team. But first, from you, Brian.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you, Kevin. Before we start, I just wanted to ask people who are watching this on YouTube to please subscribe. If you're watching it on Facebook, follow us if you're not already, and you can find us on Twitter as well at ShadowProofCom. And just a reminder, as always, 100% reader-supported news organization. We depend on your donations and your memberships to do this show, to pay our freelancers, to keep the website online. So if you like Kevin's excellent reporting, if you like what we do, please head over to shadowproof.com/donate and consider joining us. With that being said, Kevin, I think we have a pretty good conversation for today. So let's just dive right in with this latest news on the Vault 7 leaks.
Yeah, I wanted to work this in here. Of course, this leaker, if you are not terribly familiar with this case, he was accused of releasing the Vault 7 materials, which came from the CIA. These revealed details related to offensive cyber hacking tools that the CIA has available in order to conduct their own covert operations. And they were published by WikiLeaks. His name is Joshua Schulte. The defense for his defense attorneys maintain that he, in fact, is actually not the one who committed the leak, and they've put the burden on the prosecution in a very significant way to prove, in fact, that he was the leaker. So they're not even defending him as like a whistleblower. They just say he's not the one. And it might actually be the case. There's a story which we're not going to focus on specifically, but I've seen a headline suggesting that Joshua Schulte wanted to see Edward Snowden executed. Now, if you know anything about whistleblowers, I can't imagine someone who was involved in releasing this material and believed that WikiLeaks should publish it would advocate for Edward Snowden to be executed. So that's uncharacteristic. But from Inner City Press, if you go to Twitter, this is a journalist's account, Matthew Lee, who's been doing exceptional work in the city of New York, going to this trial, tweeting about developments within it. And we have this report from Inner City Press, which I'm just going to read verbatim because I think it's a crucial development. So his defense has moved for a mistrial. And this is based on the government withholding material information until the middle of the trial. So this is what is quoted at Inner City Press. Dear Judge Crotty, defendant Joshua Adam Schulte respectfully moves for a mistrial because the government has improperly withheld critical discovery and trial materials, including exculpatory information in violation of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments and the federal rules of criminal procedure. First, the government failed to disclose an internal August 2019 memorandum from the Deputy Director of the CIA for Counterintelligence to the Director of Security, requesting that one of its employees, known to the jury as Michael, this is a pseudonym for this person's protection, that he be placed on enforced administrative leave because of suspicion that he was involved in the theft and disclosure of the Vault 7 and Vault 8 information. The request was granted, and Michael has been on paid leave since. This information and any related documents should have been disclosed to the defense pursuant to Brady rules, Brady's general ruling that governs how you're supposed to be able to get access to discovery evidence if you're a defendant. Second, despite repeated requests, the government improperly refused to permit the defense to inspect or copy mirror images of a CIA server and another server, so CIA servers. So denying the defense access to servers that contain information that would have been useful to the defense. So this is a huge development in this case. It's the kind of thing that you could actually blow up the prosecution's case entirely. And so all I can do is say, I recommend that you go follow the latest developments as Inner City Press reports on them. Or I'm sure you'll see other updates in the news media, particularly in New York in the coming days. But follow this account, because this is where I just got this latest update, and they're doing crucial work.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate these updates. We've talked about this case a few times on the show, and we will stick with it. So thank you, Kevin. I wanted to move on next to some reporting that you did over the past week relating to Chelsea Manning and her ongoing refusal to testify in the grand jury. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on here?
Yeah, so we have a new statement from Chelsea Manning, where she once again affirms that she will under no circumstance testify before this grand jury impaneled in Alexandria that was set up to destroy WikiLeaks. And then her legal team has filed this new motion that they hope will force her release from jail. It outlines again, but in even more clear and stark terms, that she will not be coerced by confinement or financial sanctions. Some of the details, for example, relate to a personality assessment that was conducted by a doctor who reviewed her state in prison. This might resonate with you, Brian, given what you've done, where you cover prisoners on a regular basis. There's a concern that she's actually being institutionalized while she's been at this facility, because she's becoming this kind of a person that is afraid to leave the prison or jail, and is concerned about what will happen to her if she returns to the community. And it's affecting her mental state. And there's also the fact that she sees all the kinds of support that she has for what she's doing in resisting. So even as she is doing, even as her incarceration or as her confinement does damage to her physical and mental health, she won't quit, because people around the world see her as a hero for standing up and resisting this grand jury. So it's a thing that's being put forward and presented to the judge, that you have to stop this because it's not coercive anymore. It's outlived its purpose. There's no way that she's going to come before the court and this grand jury and testify. So now you're just punishing her, and that's not what this subpoena was intended to do. That's not why we have grand jury subpoenas. She says in her statement, which was kind of heavy for me, is that she lost her mother, that her mother, Susan Fox, died in Wales, and she was unable to go to her funeral because she's been going through this. So she insists that there's nothing that she's going to do that anybody can say to her in order to change her mind. She's going to continue to resist because she believes that the grand jury system is just supremely flawed and morally wrong. She sees problems, improprieties with the way in which the case against WikiLeaks and Julian Assange has been carried out, and how this grand jury has been set up. So that's another aspect of her resistance. And she owes $235,000 in fines right now, and they get into the financial sanctions element and how she could spend the next 45 years of her life paying a percentage of these fines that have accrued, and there's no way that she would pay all of the money that she's expected to pay to the court. And it's expected, this was expected to coerce her, but instead the threat of financial ruin has almost added to her resolve, almost added to her sense that something unjust is being done to her and she needs to stand up against it. And so it's up to the judge, really. It's in the judge's hands now to stop this, because it's cruelty to a person, what we're seeing unfold.
I'm glad that you used that word, Kevin, because that's exactly what was going through my mind. I mean, I think at this point, it's probably undeniable that the cruelty is the point here. And yeah, I think that it's clear that there is no coercive effect on this. It's only just deepening the trauma of her already, a decade that she's experienced incarceration. And I think that, to your point about her fear of leaving, I think these are, pretty telltale signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. And, something that I think doctors and medical professionals are increasingly recognizing among populations of people who've experienced incarceration. So, I think at this point, I personally would venture to say that the court is torturing Chelsea. There is no really, viable reason to keep her there and to expect any change in her condition. This is cruel and unusual punishment for someone being held for these reasons.
And 2 points to add to that, which relate to what you said, and we'll get them in here before we move on to the next topic, is that the motion makes it very clear there is no evidence that the government has been prevented from indicting anyone because Chelsea Manning refused to testify. So let's say you're a law enforcement person and you care about the law enforcement point of view. That's not where I come at this story, but let's say you were. There is no law enforcement purpose for keeping her in jail because there is no disruption to the ability of the Justice Department to pursue people within WikiLeaks, which, by the way, is wrong. I don't think you should be pursuing anyone connected to WikiLeaks. But let's say you thought that there was a good reason to go after WikiLeaks. Chelsea Manning is not in the way at all. Secondly, you have in the motion reference to UN Special Rapporteur Niels Meltzer's letter, or he put together this package that pointed out all these problems with the way Chelsea Manning is being cruelly treated, and sent it to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And he called what she was going through torture. And to be clear here, this is the second time in a decade that the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has accused the U.S. government of torturing Chelsea Manning. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you think about that and what the government, and what the UN is set up to do, I don't know that there's any other examples out there of where the UN has had to speak up in two separate instances for the safety of a person in a country because they're being tortured and abused.
Right. I mean, I think you would be justified in wondering if at this point there is even an interest on behalf of the government in attempting to continue coercing her into potentially saying something, or if it's just, a way to keep her incarcerated and keep her under state control after Obama commuted her sentence. So I think that a lot of this, from my perspective, is not quite what it seems, in the sense that the reasons that we're being told that she's being held and what the government says that they expect to come of it, I question whether those are legitimate. Thank you for that, Kevin. This is an excellent piece that you wrote. We'll link to it. I encourage people to go to shadowproof.com and read it. The headline was "Hardships Chelsea Manning has endured are unlike any other case of grand jury resistance." So please check that out, and we will link to it. So we have a few things here pertaining to Julian Assange. You're getting ready to head over to the UK and do your coverage, which I'm very excited about to bring to everyone. Why don't we begin here, and you tell us a little bit about something that has made a lot of headlines, actually, in a case that I feel like hasn't gotten as much attention as it really warrants. This definitely garnered more attention than I think a lot of the things we've seen on Assange. Can you run people through this and explain the significance here with what happened with the offer of a pardon from Trump?
All right. So this is like, the media is ridiculous, first of all. And I'm going to read what actually was the lawyer's statement, because almost every other piece that you'll read about what supposedly happened is quoting their own interpretation of what they think the Assange legal team said to the court. And everyone is so addled by the 2016 election, still going through post-traumatic disorder and dealing with the fact that Donald Trump was elected and they believe there was Russia collusion, that they're not able to just do basic facts when it comes to a story like this. So this is the quote. What happened in the court is that they went to the judge and they said that Dana Rohrabacher, is former congressperson, was going to see Mr. Assange. I'm getting this from Edward Fitzgerald, who was referring to Jennifer Robinson, who's a lawyer. So right off the bat, I have a problem because this is a lawyer on a legal team who is saying that he heard from another lawyer on the legal team that this is happening. But I don't imagine that there's hearsay in the way that it was filed with the court. They're getting to a due process argument, which is why this is being put into the record, being brought before the judge in the UK. So Dana Rohrabacher supposedly went to see Mr. Assange and said that on instructions from Donald Trump, he would offer a pardon or some other way out of the legal predicament in which Assange found himself if Julian Assange would say Russia had nothing to do with the DNC leaks. That's the quote. The quote is not Julian Assange said he would help the Trump administration deny that Russia was involved in hacking the DNC if he could get a pardon, or any story like that. It wasn't Julian Assange would be happy to help the Trump administration engage in a cover-up of Russia collusion. And all along, Julian Assange has always maintained that it wasn't a state actor in Russia that provided the information to him that was then published as the Podesta emails. And so it's just important to clarify that. There are a lot of questions that what happened in court. This happened on February 19th. There was an administrative hearing. It wasn't really even supposed to be a hearing where news would be broken, where anything major would develop. But there was a preview that we were given of the kinds of thing we're going to hear from the defense next week on February 25th, when the legal team for Assange is able to put forward a body of evidence to make the case that Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States. And part of their argument is going to be that this violates due process, that if Julian Assange is under sealed indictment or even indicted, and then Donald Trump is suggesting to a defendant that I can get you out of this legal jeopardy if you do something for me, that's improper. And it doesn't have to have anything to do with Russia. It's just anytime you would do this with someone, that would be improper. I mean, it's wrong to use the Justice Department in this way in order to protect or improve your political standing as a president.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. I want to move into our next, you were starting to touch on some of the arguments that are going to be presented in this effort to prevent his extradition to the United States. Can you talk a little bit about this next piece we have here about sort of the political offenses and why that matters in the extradition case?
Yeah, I wanted to go through this article that I wrote back in, it was 2012. This was when Julian Assange was granted asylum by the Ecuador government. Rafael Correa was the president. The government had not been taken over by a right-wing president, Lenin Moreno, who was going to attack and try to drive Julian Assange insane until he agreed on his own to leave the embassy or was forced out. So you had a government that cared about the institution of political asylum and was willing to grant political asylum to Julian Assange because in this application that was given to them, Assange outlined political offenses that he was accused of committing. And because he was accused of these offenses, he was in imminent danger. And then there was a list of points that suggested that he could end up being in a situation where his rights were violated, or that his personal safety and freedom were in jeopardy if Ecuador did not step in and do something to protect him. And I'm going to go down this list just because next week we're going to have an opening argument from the United States. On Monday, we're going to have we're going to see an opening argument from the people who represent Julian Assange. Then we're going to see some time spent on the UK-US extradition treaty that exists, where it says you cannot extradite someone solely on the basis of political offenses. So it's going to be a big deal to argue this out in court, whether the allegations of violating the Espionage Act, the 17 counts that Julian Assange faces, do these amount to political offenses. And then Friday and anything after that is going to be outstanding issues that are litigated that need to be handled before we move on to that 3-week extradition hearing that'll be coming up in May. And of course, I'm going to be there. But now let's walk through what was presented to Ecuador. Essentially, the people who represented Assange at the time, some of them are still representing him now, but his legal team has had some fluctuation. But they told Ecuador he was an award-winning communications professional, internationally renowned for his struggle for freedom of expression, press freedom, and human rights in general, that he had shared with the public, the global audience, documentary information generated by various sources and affected employees, countries, and organizations. There was strong evidence of retaliation by the country or countries that produced the information disclosed by Mr. Assange, retaliation that may endanger their safety, integrity, and even his life. That despite the diplomatic efforts of Ecuador, countries which have required adequate safeguards to protect the safety and life of Mr. Assange have refused to facilitate them. That certain Ecuadorian authorities believe that it was possible the extradition of Mr. Assange to a third country outside the European Union without proper guarantees for their safety and personal integrity, that this could happen. That legal evidence clearly showed that given an extradition to the United States of America, Mr. Assange would not have a fair trial, could be tried by special courts or the military, and it is unlikely that it is applied to cruel and degrading, and was sentenced. So he would be sentenced to life imprisonment or capital punishment, which would not respect the human rights. That while Mr. Assange must answer for an investigation in Sweden, at the time we still had this case unfolding in Sweden with some sexual allegations, and there are numerous improprieties which we have discussed previously, and that case exists no more. And that was unfolding at the time. So Ecuador was aware that the Swedish prosecutor has had a contradictory attitude that prevented Mr. Assange the full exercise of the legitimate right of defense. Ecuador was convinced that they have other countries around the world have undermined the procedural rights of Mr. Assange during the investigation. Ecuador has found that Mr. Assange is without protection and assistance to be received from the state, which is a citizen, and that following several public statements and diplomatic communications by officials from Britain, Sweden, and USA, it's inferred that these governments would not respect the conventions and treaties and give priority to domestic law school hierarchy in violation of rules expressed universal law. So that's a lot of jargon, but basically that the UK, the United States, Sweden, and even Australia is responsible, I think, because Julian Assange comes from Australia, that they would not be stepping in to respect conventions and treaties to defend him from being tortured, to protect his rights as he is being targeted for prosecution. and that if he was reduced to custody in Sweden, it would start a chain of events that would prevent the further protective measures taken that could help him avoid extradition to a third country. So that's an important part. All along, you had attorneys representing Julian Assange. I think of Center for Constitutional Rights attorney Michael Ratner, who unfortunately is no longer around to be an advocate for WikiLeaks anymore, but he was constantly on shows like Democracy Now! Warning that if Julian Assange went to Sweden, then Sweden would be able to pass him on to the United States for extradition. Sweden wasn't able to get him, and so it became that the UK got, they benefited from Ecuador kicking him out of the embassy. But still, what we've seen is once he left that embassy, he immediately was vulnerable and arrested, and he is now in this state where he could potentially be brought to trial here in the United States. And so when we're thinking about the issue of political offenses next week, this is what we're talking about. These kinds of issues that were walked through by Ecuador and Julian Assange's team in the process of being granted asylum, that's what is going to be argued over in the UK court. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think that made sense. Thank you very much for that. We can get to the end here talking a little bit about what people can expect from your coverage while you're over there, but I think that was very important. We've been going for about 25 minutes now, so I wanted to take us to the next and final story that you have listed here involving the DNC lawsuit and an affirmation of Assange's First Amendment rights. This isn't a story that I had heard about or seen, previous to you bringing it to my attention. So can you tell us about this story?
Yeah. So again, this is an older story that I wrote up and covered last year in August. Judge John Kodal in the Southern District of New York issued a ruling against the Democratic National Committee, which had sued WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange, trying to hold it liable for publishing information that they believed came from Russian agents who stole this information. And importantly, what happened in this particular case is that Kodal ended up defending and affirming the First Amendment rights of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. We're going to see next week an argument put forward by the United States that Julian Assange does not have First Amendment rights. So it's crucial to be aware of this precedent in a federal court in the United States, which the Justice Department will have to overcome in order to make their argument. Well, not to mention that they don't really have a great legal argument anyways, that they're concocting this. The fact of the matter is that if he's charged under the Espionage Act, which is a U.S. law, then he should have First Amendment rights like any U.S. citizen who would be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. So either he doesn't have First Amendment rights and he can't be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, or he does have First Amendment rights, which is why he shouldn't be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. So it's quite a predicament and dilemma that the Justice Department should find itself in. And I'm eager to hear how they're going to try to unravel this pretzel that they have created. But again, just to run this down, John Kodal said that basically whether or not WikiLeaks knew the materials were obtained illegally, they were protected by the First Amendment. And that goes to this case that we're talking about, this upcoming extradition hearing. It revolves around information that Chelsea Manning was accused of stealing from the US government. And WikiLeaks was protected in publishing it the same way that the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, if the Guardian's reporters were working in the United States, they would all be protected. And just to be clear, this is a quote from Kodal. the First Amendment prevents such liability in the same way it would preclude liability for press outlets that publish materials of public interest despite defects in the way the materials were obtained, so long as the disseminator did not participate in any wrongdoing in obtaining the materials in the first place. Well, right there, I can tell you that 17 of the 18 counts immediately should probably be thrown out.
Right.
That leaves only the conspiracy to commit a computer crime charge to be litigated and to have the defense put on a clear case as to why he was just, using privacy or anonymity tools or working with a source, was not aiding a source in their ability to steal information. And if you could convince a judge, and if that judge can recognize that the technology and what was happening in this relationship was not a part of a conspiracy, then there really isn't a charge there. And so again, and whether or not that charge is actually recognized in the UK may be a question. Mm-hmm. Is it just a US crime, and does it exist in the UK? I don't know. I'm not a British resident, so I'm not sure. But as you can tell from this lawsuit that we're talking about here, this is a huge issue for the Justice Department to overcome. And I'm absolutely certain that the legal team representing Julian Assange has this precedent from federal court, and they'll be using it to try and defang any possibility that the U.S. has of succeeding in this extradition hearing.
Mm-hmm. I'm hesitant to do this, Kevin, because I don't want to necessarily make you put on your prognosticator pundit hat. I know that we don't like to speculate too much, but it is interesting to me that these are pretty enormous hurdles facing the Justice Department. And, most prosecutors either want to coerce a plea or they have a case that they know they're going to win. They don't generally take cases to trial that they don't think that they'll prevail through one of those two means. So do you have any sense of the, maybe even just on the conspiracy charge of the likelihood that the Justice Department can actually keep this together and successfully prosecute him? Is that something you don't want to even weigh in on? I just feel like you've covered a few of these cases where we've seen the government pull out all the stops and engage in all kinds of bullshit to really come down hard on someone. And this one seems particularly ridiculous. What is your take on that?
Well, I think that the government is banking on the ostracization of Julian Assange and that people don't like him and loathe him, and so it should be easier to prosecute him. But the problem with that is it really doesn't matter who you are as an individual when it comes to the law. I mean, this isn't Julian Assange, but he could be somebody who is guilty of cannibalism, mm-hmm. but that wouldn't have any bearing at all on this case. It's an issue of whether he committed the crime or not. I'm using a very extreme example to say that that doesn't win you this legal case. You still have to prove that everything that we've just discussed in this show. And I don't think that the evidence is on the side of the US. I think that what we're seeing happen in Europe is that there are politicians from various European countries that see this as a hugely dangerous road to go down in order to allow the United States to extradite a journalist, he's a journalist, mm-hmm. to the United States. Or if you don't want to call him a journalist, he was at least engaged in the act of journalism. Mm-hmm. And by being engaged in the act of journalism, he deserves these protections. And so they are going to be there as observers. I expect to encounter and meet a few of these MPs from Germany and other countries throughout Europe that are going to be traveling there in order to see the way in which the United States is making this argument. We're doing something that is very abusive, being able to assert that we could jail anyone who maybe caused secrets from the United States to be released, and all because the US government lost the ability to keep these secrets secure. They're now using this as a means to punish. So, granted, Julian Assange had no part in leaking this information. All he did is publish it. But because the US government was embarrassed that they lost control of classified information, they're coming down on Julian Assange and making him pay for publishing this information, that it's their fault that it was shared with us. So, it's up to them to figure this out, and they shouldn't be punishing people in the. My phone just went off in the middle of this interview. It was a spam caller. I can't even blame it on the CIA, which would be good for this show. My phone actually identified it as a spam call. But anyways, but I mean, if I have to look forward as to what will unfold, I think that this case, we should prepare ourselves going forward into this next week, that the timeline of events is going to be a long timeline. We are looking at the strong possibility that the United States loses in this first round, appeals it to the next court, and then appeals it to the next court, and it's won in the European Court of Human Rights. That is where ultimately the extradition gets squashed. But that's going to take multiple years. There is, I hesitate to do this, but I also think that I'm not being objective as a pundit if I ignore this. And I guess the reason why I would be hesitant to say this is because I don't want people to see me as just a biased person inserting my own political ideology. But the reality is, if someone like Bernie Sanders was elected president in the United States in November, I'm confident in saying that this would all go away. That is one argument I am willing to make, because we have a statement from his campaign from last year saying that he's opposed to using the Espionage Act in this manner. We don't have a specific statement where he's like championing Julian Assange as some kind of like truth teller, but what we do have is a statement that this is not a policy the Justice Department should be adopting, where they go after journalists for publishing classified information, and recognizing that these are the risks that were connected to the Pentagon Papers, and that we can't go down this road and have the same kind of thing going on with the Justice Department. And of course, there's the international global issues of trying to impose our own secrecy law on people around the world, and what that means if other countries decide that they want to impose their own secrecy laws on all of us. So I think there's a political future in where this goes away. As far as the legal future, if we don't consider politics at all in the United States, well, because Boris Johnson's in the UK, and he's not going to squash this extradition for Donald Trump. So he's going to probably continue to do this against Julian Assange. The UK government is going to remain opposed to Julian Assange. But legally, it's going to take several years in the court system in the UK to work and play itself out. Brexit has no bearing. This case will continue to move through the courts. And so, I mean, but then that means he's in jail for all of this time. And is not free. And then of course there's the question of what happens with Chelsea Manning, and what happens with Jeremy Hammond, who we haven't talked about, who is also there for contempt and being refusing to go before the grand jury and testify. And so, like, I'd say that the Trump administration, what people should do, if I was looking forward and saying what could bring this to an abrupt end, it's the only thing that has ever brought this empire to its knees. And it's when they are so embarrassed and so made to feel shame when they are standing before the global community that they have to back down from what they're doing. For example, Chelsea Manning released a log, a communications log or a cable that was sent around. It was a communications log that was sent as a diplomatic cable that revealed war crimes or had a lot of detail about a war crime in Iraq. And UN people were concerned about it. And it documented executions of people by a team that conducted a raid in Iraq. And it was public, and I've written about this, and maybe it's something we could share come next week, just because I think as an example, it shows how you can make the United States back down, even when you say, okay, they're a superpower. They're not going to budge. They're going to do what they want. But in Iraq, they were fighting for immunity for U.S. soldiers so that they could remain and occupy Iraq. But because of this cable and then the backlash that ensued after it, you saw the Iraqi government and you saw other governments come together and support and say, no, we're going to force you out of the country. You can't stay. And then Barack Obama had to withdraw troops from Iraq because he wasn't going to get U.S. forces to end an occupation. So I think the way that you end the Trump administration's prosecution of Julian Assange is you have to tremendously embarrass them. And maybe that's what happens in the UK. Maybe the way in which we all tune into this farce, this tragedy and farce that is going to be unfolding, and the way we unpack it. I mean, I'm going to this court. It's called Woolwich, and it's connected to the Belmarsh prison where Julian Assange is being held. And he's there confined, and there are going to be a ton of press that are in attendance. What percentage of the press do you think are in favor of this trial being carried out against Julian Assange? No, I don't mean like what percentage of them hate Julian Assange. That's not the question. The question is, what percentage of them are okay with a government prosecuting someone for publishing classified information, who understand in the back of their head that this has some impact on their profession? I think it's got to be small. My bet is that people who are going to be in attendance, there's maybe, I'll be charitable, 20 to 30% are supportive of what the Trump administration are doing to some degree. 70% are on the side of press freedom organizations, and while they may not label him a journalist, they do not endorse Donald Trump going after Julian Assange. And so that means that the coverage coming out is going to be the kind of coverage that shows you why it is wrong for the Trump administration to be doing what it's doing. The only thing that I'm going to be trying to guard against is we can't get bogged down in Russia hysteria while we're trying to parse out this case. None of that matters. I don't want to hear anything from any correspondent from CNN or any kind of monologue from Jake Tapper about, Julian Assange and how we could bring him back to the US and he could be put on a stand and he could provide evidence that Robert Mueller could be using to provide us some way of showing that Trump really did collude with Russia, and let's start impeachment proceedings all over again. And no, that is all just madness that people need to ignore, because nothing in this case has anything to do with the DNC leaks and anything that happened in 2016. The Trump administration came after Julian Assange for the Afghanistan war logs, and that's what we need to talk about. So if you're going to talk about this honestly, you talk about how this press, global press, has done an abysmal job of talking about what's going on in Afghanistan, and they've allowed the government of the United States to lie about what is going on with the war, mislead us into believing that it's a success when it has been a supreme failure, that we've had the Afghanistan papers in the last year that showed that even high-ranking officials know this to be true. We know that Chelsea Manning released these war logs and why she released them. We know that they revealed like assassination squads. We know that they revealed other details related to torture. And so that's what we have available for us to talk about why this information was in the public interest. And we don't need to buy into the national security doctrine of the Trump administration to demonize Julian Assange and make it seem like he should be extradited to the United States and put on trial. And I think that's a good place to leave it for now, because there will be plenty of work to do next week. And I intend to be posting on a daily basis at shadowproof.com, as well as we have a collaboration that we've ironed out with Common Dreams, which I hope we can say to people that you should be able to find our work there. At least Common Dreams has been very kind enough to help me gain access and get a press credential to the court. So I know they're in the middle of their fundraising drive. So I'm willing to give the floor to them and say, if you have a few dollars and you can chip in to support Common Dreams, go over there, give them $3 or $5 just to show your appreciation for them. I know that might be a little counterintuitive when we are raising our own funds, trying to help me pay for costs going to London. But just spend a day trying to take care of them first. And then next week, we'll hit you up for some money and ask if you can support them. Because honestly, without their help, I would not have a ticket next week in order to be in the courtroom covering what's going to be unfolding with Assange. There's going to be a ton of media there trying to put out reporting. And I'm going to have to be there like on 2.5 hours before court even starts, just so that I can claim my seat. It's going to be a bit of a spectacle. So that's what I leave you. I'll be sharing what is unfolding at the court. I don't know as far as social media posting what I'll be able to do, but the plan is to share dispatches either in print or through videos like this with you so that you can get updates. And I do encourage you to rely on reporting from myself or others who you do know have spent time covering this case extensively. I'd beware of outlets that are parachuting in who have not been following this regularly in the last year. No matter their reach, there are certain nuances and details that they are going to miss, and you should just try and support independent media like us who have been paying close attention, and we'll separate the fact from fiction for you by not even paying any attention to the fiction. I don't want to hear what CNN got wrong or what MSNBC got wrong or what the New York Times did wrong. Just stick with us. I was there. I can tell you what happened with Julian Assange on any given day. I'm going to be able to do my own fact checking and verify certain statements that are said in court. Anything that's breaking news, you can come to Shadowproof. We're going to have that breaking news.
Thank you. That was all very well said. I won't add to that. I'll just say that definitely solidarity with Common Dreams. I have to say thank you to them because, like you said, we wouldn't be able to gain access quite the way we did without them. I'll leave it there. You'll find more from us. If you have questions about anything that transpires with Kevin's coverage, you can reach us at editor@shadowproof.com. I'll be happy to relay those to Kevin and see what we can respond to. Again, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our email newsletter as well that Kevin manages. You can find a link to that on the website, but I'm sure we'll have updates and be feeding some of those dispatches through there. Thank everybody for watching and for donating and for supporting. If you can chip in to us and to Common Dreams, that would be great. For us, it's shadowproof.com/donate. And
split your donation.
Yeah,
if you've got a
donation this week,
split your donation.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you to everybody out there watching, and we will talk to you next week.